Welcome back to vlog number 2. We're in the sauna. We'll see how long this one lasts. Usually the phone gets too hot and cuts out. But I thought I'd use this opportunity while away from a little bit from the kids to discuss or to hone in a little bit more on how the market is right now in 2025, similar point of the cycle 2005, June, mid 2005. So the economy in mid 2005 had well recovered out of the dot-com bust and was away at the races. Speculation was even coming back. Everyone began to becoming a bit of an investor guru. Strong markets, 2005, 2006, and then big lead up bull run up into the peak in October 2007 before we then went through the global financial crisis, or the GFC. So we're entering now a similar period like 2005, 2006, early 2007, before the market topped out, before we go through the next land-driven downturn. So it's becoming crucial and most pivotal point of time now to make sure you get your market selection right, and even type of asset at a more micro level, because yes, there are clear booming markets like Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide. Some of the regions are going gangbusters, but they're not necessarily the right markets to be getting into right now at this later stage of the cycle. And people will find out the hard way. As a classic example, Townsville. Lots of people are ploughing into Townsville right now. And if you look at historical sales data, Townsville did well lead up to 2005, and then 2005-06 even did 20-30% in each of those years, even more, depending what suburb and what product, if you're looking at a house or a unit. But then once the market topped out and entered 2008 GFC, it went backwards for near 13-14 years, where it lost all its gains that it received between 2005 and 2007. So that's a classic example where, markets, when they start to go gangbusters and they start to get all euphoric, and it sucks a lot of the mainstream people in that aren't necessarily across all the data and the history of each market. And even some buyers agents out there these days that I'm seeing pushing these markets, that they're obviously clearly not across the 18-year land cycle and histories. As if they're buying in those markets, they're only going to set themselves up for failure in the next coming years once the market turns. So it is crucial. There's only probably I'd say a dozen suburbs that you want to buy into in 2025, and as the years go on, there will become more and more suburbs that will be key suburbs to invest in. But every year that goes by, we look at history and compare it to a similar point of the cycle based off the 18-year land cycle, and work out which markets were the best markets to invest in, and even what types of property, because not all property right now is the best property to buy. As an example, regional houses, they're not the best asset to be buying now, because they've had significant bull runs the last 5 to 7 years. They've just taken off since the mid-cycle slowdown, and all the way up until this where we are today in the land boom, and now entering the winner's curse, the final few years of the speculation of the 18-year land cycle before it turns into the land-driven downturn. So that's during that sort of midpoint of the cycle. That's when the regions tend to have a flow-on effect post the metro markets where people get priced out, they can no longer afford them in the metro markets, so they start looking regional. It's not a coincidence that it was the supposed COVID recession that pushed everyone out into the regions. It happens every cycle in the second half and later stages of the 18-year land cycle. So now is not the time to be heading out into the regions and buying a regional house, because, I mean, I'm all for buying regional houses. In my personal portfolio, I've got 10 or so regional houses, but I was paying as little as 120,000 and as high as 250, not even 230. Now they're all worth 400 plus, or 350, 400 plus, but they've doubled in value the last 3 to 4, 5 years. So now you don't want to get into a market after the market's gone through 100% growth, because it'll reach its limits. Sure, it might have another 10, 15, 20% over the next couple of years, but once the market turns, and even regional New South Wales and regional Victoria is already starting to soften. So they're 2 years into a protracted stagnant period, which could last up to 8, 9, 10 years. But regional Queensland will run for another two years, I'd say. 2, maybe 3, but yeah, probably around 2 years before it'll top out and then commence another protracted, stagnant, negative period, which can last up to 12, 13, even 14 years up in Queensland, because those regions are dependent on the mines, so they tend to boom for longer, and then they tend to be suppressed for longer. So the regional houses are definitely not our top pick. But I mean, we'll come back around. Every market, every type of asset has its time in the sun, and right now it is definitely not regional houses. There's only certain suburbs, certain macro markets, certain types of property that will perform over the next 2 to 5 years, which is where we're buying now. And then after they'll become pretty well mainstream that these are the areas to invest in, people will then start ploughing in, like they're doing so to Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide, at which point we'll then be off to the next location, where I believe the flow-on effect or the growth will spill out into as the next 18-year land cycle plays out. So we're always going to be around 3 to 4 years ahead of the mainstream, because we like to buy in the suppressed markets when days on market are higher. The growth, you may think your growth is not there in the immediate term, which could be correct. So, I mean, it's not going to go gangbusters tomorrow, but over the next 4 to 5 years, it'll turn into the leading outperforming market, and then we'll have substantial growth over the next 10 to 15 years. I'd rather get into a market that's only just starting to warm up after a protracted 8, 9, 10 year stagnant period, rather than rushing into a market that's gone absolutely ballistic the last five years and gone up 100%, because it doesn't go on forever. It never does. Markets can really only go up around 180, 200% before it tops out, and then it will soften, and then that's trough to peak, and then it goes through another stagnant period. So by getting into markets after they've had their stagnant period, you're pretty much minimizing any downside risk. Once it's been tested for 5, 6, 7 years, property doesn't go to zero. It just goes to probably about half the intrinsic value, which is half the rebuild cost. People then see value after a certain period of time as the yields start to rise. As yields become attractive, 6, 7, 8% yields, that then draws on investors. The smart investors, smart money comes in first, buys all the bargains, even when there's real pessimistic commentary around the markets, similar to like 2018, 2019 in Brisbane. Everyone was talking down Brisbane. We were buying as much as we could for 150 grand, 200 grand. These days everything's going for 400 plus. So, but most people like to get into Brisbane now and say, well, the Olympic Games is coming up and property's still cheap compared to Sydney. But the reality is you can't compare markets to other markets. It's like comparing apples with oranges. Sydney is a global city, competes with global talent, similar to LA, New York, Hong Kong, Beijing, these large global cities. They're in a whole different ballgame compared to Brisbane. Brisbane, yes, is a nice city, but I mean, it's by no means a global city. It might get there over the next 50, 100 years, but at this stage, it's not. So you can't be comparing the cost of a unit in Brisbane to the same cost of a unit in Sydney, or houses in Brisbane versus houses in Sydney. So each market needs to be assessed and evaluated on its own merits, based off how it's performed historically and how it's performed now, because markets don't just continue to go 200, 300, 400, 500% capital growth over the same growth cycle session. It goes through a strong bull run, it then tops out, softens for 10 years before it then experiences its next significant bull run. So that's why we believe Brisbane is, yes, a good market, and obviously we've been buying there over the last few years, but it's reaching its limits and we're no longer buying.